Good evening, everyone. My name is David Hoffman, and it is my distinct privilege and pleasure to welcome you to this, the third in our series of continuing legal education and continuing education across the professions session on implicit bias and systemic racism in healthcare. This time looking at the important function of interpretation services in providing any care ever to anyone at all. So let's start. I'm going to dispense with the usual legalisms because we're lawyers and because it's required. So this is intended as a broad and general continuing education program for doctors, lawyers, social workers, nurse practitioners, every imaginable kind of clinician or human services individual, but we are able to grant continuing legal education credit. And this is the required explanation of the rules for obtaining continuing legal education credit. I'm required to show that to you. And I'm also required to tell you that the presenters have no financial conflicts of interest to disclose, though we all do have interests, and you're going to learn a lot about them today. And it is for that reason that I also want to say that though many people may share our various opinions for the purpose of our statements made tonight, opinions expressed by the participants do not necessarily represent the positions of their respective institutions. Having dispensed with the formalities, let me introduce you to the panel tonight. I'm going to give a brief introduction to the topic, and then you're going to hear from Andrew Friedman, who is a lawyer, but has spent his entire career since before he graduated from law school, engaging in community organizing around a variety of issues, but most heavily focused when he and I first met, interesting circumstances, I will tell you the story, around healthcare and healthcare access. Jorge Rivera is a lawyer as well and is the healthcare counsel to the New York State Senate Majority Conference and Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart Cousins, and we'll be talking about some of the technical legislative aspects of language access. Tracy Koss actually does the work, which is to say that she is an interpreter in hospitals where she encounters patients who have had a variety of experiences with interpretation services, good and bad, and we're going to talk about that in our general discussion at the end of the program. Joyita Dastidar is a physician, part of the bioethics community at Columbia, a bioethics consultant at the Columbia University Irving Medical Center, and is a hospitalist, meaning that she is taking care of patients day and night during the course of an acute care admission. Dinaris, also known as Didi Sanchez, another member of the Columbia Bioethics family and the project manager of the Washington Heights, Hamilton Heights Inwood project on aging and Alzheimer's, and is going to speak to you about how the healthcare delivery system is seen, for better and for worse, in the communities that are serviced by our healthcare institutions, communities where English is not most people's first language. So I'm really, really excited to have this remarkable group of people brought together to talk about what is an enormously important issue that before Andrew and his partner in crime, Una Chatterjee, started Make the Road by Walking in the early 2000s, or started doing this work in the early 2000s, was not something that people thought much about and frankly had much interest or concern with. So I'm going to talk about how provision of interpretation services became a standard of care issue. Andrew's going to talk about the role of advocacy and organizing in changing the conversation about legal duty. Jorge is going to talk about legislation and what it's accomplished and what it still needs to accomplish. Oops, sorry, I have to advance my screen here. Tracy is going to talk about what it's like to actually do the work, both from a clinical perspective, vocabulary and all of that, and from an ethical perspective. What are the obligations of an interpreter to simultaneously faithfully translate the words and also make sure that the meaning is being properly conveyed? Not an easy task. Then we're going to hear from Joyita talking about what it's like both to be a native Spanish speaker and what it's like to work with patients who speak other languages where she herself has to rely upon interpretation services, and really talk to us about how that goes at the bedside. And finally, Dee Dee's going to talk about how interpretation services are perceived and received in the community, so that we have a better understanding of what our patients, our customers, need from the healthcare delivery system and what we can do to recognize our legal obligation to do that. Oops. So first, let's remind ourselves why we're here and why it's important to be talking about law and bioethics and implicit bias. This is a quote from Nakia Alexander, who was one of the speakers at our first implicit bias continuing education program, where we looked at really the clinical details. And she had this quote in a remarkable documentary she did from a patient at New York Presbyterian Hospital, which is the University Hospital of Columbia University, of course. And this patient said, as a patient that has experienced microaggressions in healthcare, it feels like you have to constantly advocate for yourself. And that is exhausting. We should take that sentiment in the context of the core duty to communicate with patients in order to get their permission to provide care. This is the oft-quoted assertion, really bold, even heretical statement of Benjamin Cardozo in 1914 in a piece of litigation known as Schlowendorf versus the Society of New York Hospital. And Cardozo declared quite adamantly, every human being of adult years and sound mind has a right to determine what shall be done with his own body. Odd gender selection, given that Schlowendorf was Mary Schlowendorf, and the treatment that was at issue was excision of a uterine fibroid, which her surgeons did, even though she told him ahead of time, it's okay if you go in and look around inside my uterus, but don't take anything out until we've talked about it. And the doctor thought the notion that a patient should have that much power in a medical relationship was just ridiculous. So this is what I want to talk about. How did provision of interpretation services become a standard of care question? That is, what is it that we're doing when we interact with a patient who doesn't speak the language that the interpreter speaks, and what ought we to do about that from a legal obligation perspective? And the question that lies within that is this second question. What is the professional ethical obligation of lawyers to educate and advocate regarding compliance with obligations to LEP, limited English proficiency patients, that exist as a part of the standard of care for their healthcare clients? Let me share with you, when I first was exposed to this problem, thanks to Andrew, and I started talking to the doctors at my hospital, which was in the Bushwick section of Brooklyn, a heavily, perhaps predominantly Spanish-speaking community, about the need to up our game, to take interpretation services, meaning the spoken communication between clinicians and patients, and translation, that's the written communication between clinicians and patients in different languages. When I asked them how we could go about taking that responsibility more seriously, the first response I got, and this was 20 years ago, hard to believe, the response was, well, you may want to do that, but that's going to take money away from actually providing healthcare. And I was immediately startled by that assertion, because if you can't communicate with your patient, if you can't receive a full, meaningful history and responses to a physical examination, and as important, if you can't communicate to your patient what is going on with them and what treatment is needed, and of course, what the risks, benefits, and alternatives, and the risks and benefits of the alternatives of the proposed treatment are, then, as Cardozo articulated in the Schloendorf case, you literally have no legal right to even lay a finger on them. And to think that that is something other than an integral part of healthcare, well, that was the battle that I had within the hospital, to convince doctors that this was not a luxury, this was not an add-on, this was not an auxiliary function. This was the essence of providing minimally competent healthcare. And I didn't come to that realization by myself. I needed to be coaxed along. So let me tell you the story of how I first came to understand the importance of interpretation services and the inadequacy of interpretation services at my hospital at the time. Though the efforts being made by the hospital were well-intentioned and were significant, but were not sufficient. And we didn't know they were not sufficient because, of course, that's the essence of the plight of patients with limited English proficiency. They can't tell you that they don't understand what you're saying because you can't understand them saying that they don't understand what you're saying. So one day I was out at the hospital. I was outside counsel at the time, and we were having some meeting, I don't know what, and some person from security comes bursting into the boardroom and said, "There are people protesting in front of the hospital. What should we do?" And I sat there. I'm looking at the smirk on Andrew's face. I sat there waiting for someone to say something. And nobody said anything. Doctors and nurses and administrators of every type sitting around the table, and they were all silent because nobody had trained us on what to do when somebody sets up a protest outside your hospital, right? So I decided, okay, I've given this enough time. I said, well, invite them in. And security went down to the front of the hospital and approached, I don't remember who was in the front of the crowd. It would not have been Andrew or Una, because they have from the beginning really refined and perfected the art of leading from the rear. But they invited the entire crew in. I think there were 30 or 40 people. So they all crowded into the conference room and stated their case. And I'll leave it to Andrew to describe what the case was in those early days. But the result of that first encounter, spontaneous to be sure, was an invitation back. And I asked Andrew to come back to the hospital a few days later and to bring some of the members of his organization. They all came into my office, which was small by comparison to the boardroom. Fortunately, he only showed up with about 20 people, and we brought in chairs and we sat and we talked, and it was a remarkable, remarkable conversation that led me in that moment to realize, oh, we've blown this and we need to do better. And the result of that interaction was this very legalistic looking document. You don't need to read it. You just have to sort of take in the power of the caption. This is an agreement between my hospital, Wyckoff Heights Medical Center at the time, and both the Office of the Attorney General of the State of New York, happened to have been Elliot Spitzer, and the Office of Civil Rights of the United States Department of Health and Human Services, Region 2. And this was on the state level, a resolution agreement, and on the federal level, a technical assistance plan. And what this is a contract. It's a binding agreement where Wyckoff acknowledged that though we thought we were doing the right thing, we were falling far, far short. And the agreement, which is in the materials for the program, lays out in extraordinary detail just what we were going to do differently and the extent of community engagement that we would commit to. And it worked pretty well. We still have a lot of work to do in the healthcare delivery system as a whole, but I think in those early days, in the early 2000s, I guess this was 2003. Oh yeah, February 28th, 2023. So just a little over 20 years ago, we got the ball rolling. And what flowed from that is the whole notion that hospital interpreters needed to be trained. And there was no real training available back then. So we worked with Hostas Community College to develop a program where we will actually, or we would rather actually train clinicians. And if you didn't get the materials and the affirmation will come to all of the lawyer participants. I see a question from David, another David. Those go out right after the conference, so don't worry about that. So we started training. Well, first we developed a curriculum, and then we started training interpreters in pretty significant numbers. And this process grew, and Andrew and Una and Make the Road by Walking, which is an interesting name for an organization, but it comes from a poem. And the line of the poem that I think Andrew and Una must have tripped over at some point in their lives goes like this. Seeker, there is no road. We make the road by walking. And so with that context for how this whole notion of interpretation services as a right, as a duty for clinicians, and as part of the legal standard of care, I will turn this over to Andrew to address the issue of the role of advocacy and organizing in changing the conversation about the legal duty to address health disparities. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, David. David is one of the few friends I've made where our introduction was me screaming with a placard outside of his place of work. But I'm grateful for the friendship, and I'm grateful for his work at Wyckoff and beyond, trying to do a better job once we had pointed out a problem, in his sort of remarkably undefensive response, especially given that he was the general counsel at the hospital. But I will start. So I'm Andrew Friedman. I helped found Make the Road, then Make the Road by Walking, now Make the Road New York, in the mid-90s while I was still in law school, with Una Chatterjee and a bunch of folks from the neighborhood. Make the Road sort of is a hybrid organization that provides a range of direct services, legal and also educational services, but is fundamentally about trying to create space to nurture leadership and engage in power building work with community residents. And it's grown a lot since we started as an all-volunteer operation inside the rectory of St. Barbara's Church in Bushwick, but I spent 15 years co-leading Make the Road, and then I left to start an organization called the Center for Popular Democracy, which is basically a federated network of grassroots community organizing groups like Make the Road. By the time I left the Center for Popular Democracy, 10 years later, something like 50 state-based affiliates in 38 or so states, 200 or so cities. And then I left, as David said, to start something called the Initiative for Community Power at NYU Law School, which is sort of most fundamentally about helping to train a new generation of young attorneys to understand and think carefully about kind of power building and community organizing and policy making as part of what a lawyer should be thinking about, not just litigation or legislation in some instances. And so I will start a couple years before this famous street protest, just to let you know how I got there. We started Make the Road in the, as I was saying, sort of in the mid-late 90s. It was actually February of 1997, which only the most wonky politics nerd would know was the date that Bill Clinton's oft criticized welfare reform went into effect. And again, most people probably don't know that the first iteration of so-called welfare reform was a fairly brutal attack on immigrants around the country, where legal permanent residents were cut off from eligibility for almost all government benefits. So they had been eligible for food stamps. They were no longer eligible for food stamps. They had been eligible for Medicaid. They were no longer eligible for Medicaid. They had been eligible for public assistance. They were no longer eligible for public assistance. To give you some sense of the impact of the implementation of that legislation in a neighborhood like Bushwick, 89% of the neighborhood at that point in time relied on means-tested government benefits like, Social Security, disability, or welfare, or Medicaid, or food stamps. And the vast majority of folks in the neighborhood also spoke Spanish in the home, and a very high percent of legal permanent residents. So by the time we started working out of the rectory at St. Barbara's Church, I think it's fair to say that low-income folks in Bushwick, which was almost everyone, were in a complete and total panic, because they had all basically just gotten letters saying all of your money for rent, for food, for healthcare is being taken away. And because it was Rudolph Giuliani who was the mayor in New York City, it was not a kind message, and it was not narrowly tailored. In fact, they started sending these letters to everyone with a Latino surname, whether or not they were in fact eligible or not eligible for any of these government benefits. So basically everyone had gotten these letters, and again, something like half of the people couldn't understand them because they were only in English, but everyone was petrified. We come in sort of fresh, still in law school, eager to help, big visions of kind of trying to be community organizers, and realize that our lofty vision about making the road by walking slammed into people's immediate, pressing, urgent needs to answer the question of how they're going to eat or pay their rent next month. And so for about 5 or 6 months, all we did was case handling. We asked for fair hearings. We learned how to ask for evidence packets. Luckily, Giuliani was not just malevolent, he was a terrible administrator, and the Human Resources Administration could not manage to send an evidence packet and we won all our fair hearings for many months, but we were not doing what we wanted to do, which was build political power for folks in our neighborhood so that the next time there was a big public policy decision, like the decision to change our welfare system, their needs and wants would be taken into account and they wouldn't be left essentially cut off from vital government services and support. And at some point, we sort of looked ourselves in the mirror and said, you know, we're not accomplishing what we wanted to accomplish, although what we're accomplishing is important. And so we raised a little bit of money. We hired some other folks to do most of the legal casework, and we started organizing community meetings. And we asked folks, you know, we understand you're busy, you have children to feed, you have things to do in the evening, but if you were to get involved, what would you want to get involved in trying to change about your neighborhood? And we had very interesting conversations. Almost without exception, what folks said was, nobody who I need to communicate with can communicate with me in Spanish. And it's terrifying. And so we did a little bit of research. We realized that what was happening was not just horrific and inconsiderate, but it was also illegal. It was considered national origin discrimination. It was violating the Food Stamps Act. And so we started to organize protests and we started to do legal research. And eventually that legal research led us to file a civil rights complaint with the Office for Civil Rights of the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, and also to file a lawsuit called Ramirez v. Giuliani against Mayor Giuliani and his then head of the welfare department, a guy named Jason Turner, for basically violating the Food Stamps Act. It was a long and arduous process, but we won everything. We won the civil rights complaint. We eventually, the city ended up settling the lawsuit. And we, you know, while all those things were pending, we had started working with the city council to draft legislation essentially requiring what the federal law already required, but putting in some new enforcement mechanisms. And we won that too. After we won all of this stuff, it was the early 2000s. We had a group of many hundreds of limited English proficient folks from Bushwick and South Williamsburg and some from Cypress Hills and East New York, who were meeting every week to think about our work together and to think about this campaign. And so we had the very fun conversation. So now what do we want to work on? Since we've managed to win this campaign, everyone had just gotten everyone had gotten letters from the Human Resources Administration in, I think it was something like 18 languages, essentially asking them what language they spoke and giving them different 800 numbers to call for different languages so that the city could tabulate people's language assistance needs and then could match a whole bunch of hiring and stuff like that to that. And, you know, it was a big question. That we had thought maybe folks are going to be interested in doing some other work about kind of the welfare system and the welfare centers. But again, someone shared in one of those meetings just a horrific story. And this was at Brooklyn Hospital, not at Wyckoff Hospital, but of having her 9-year-old daughter be asked to translate when the doctor told her that she had cancer. And horrific for the, obviously for the child, for the painful on multiple levels for the mother. But she said, you know what we should really do is work on the lack of translation and interpretation services in hospitals. then suddenly she had opened the floodgates. Everyone had a story about how, they were unable to communicate with people. They were often then, as a result of that inability to communicate, which, I think felt to many like they were not being taken seriously, and so they were not able to actually have doctors take seriously the pains they were having or try and intervene with the problems they were reporting, because literally they couldn't communicate. And occasionally in all these places, you'd stumble upon a Spanish-speaking doctor or nurse. Luckily, there'd be someone from the cleaning staff present who they'd pull over and get to interpret. But it was a haphazard and ineffective system. And so we started trying to think about what to do. We decided that what we needed was more information, because we had a dynamic and engaged group of 40 or 50 women in the room, and they were mostly women. But we thought, let's go figure out how widespread the problem is. And so we worked out a very straightforward one-page survey and started going and talking to patients in the waiting areas of both Wyckoff and Woodhull, which were the two closest hospitals. One obviously is a public hospital. And at both, it was something like 70 plus, I think, % of the patients who reported that they had problems accessing interpretation and translation services that they needed. And we thought to ourselves, should we meet with the hospitals to talk to them about this problem? And we decided no. And, it's interesting to be in this conversation with David because we have both perspectives, but our perspective was, you can't possibly work at one of these hospitals and not know this is a problem, because the problem is so widespread and widely reported. And we were nervous that if we went in, the hospital wouldn't take us seriously, and they would essentially glad hand us with sort of a community affairs officer, and it would start a very long and, we feared, ineffective process to reach an agreement. So we came out swinging. We organized the protest. I believe the same day that we organized the protest, we filed the complaint, a civil rights complaint, with the state attorney general's office. And we thought, now we're eager to talk because we have a process going on, and it's going to be a different kind of conversation. We were talking to David. We were not talking to the community affairs person, and we were happy about that. But, and we can talk more about it, but that was really the beginning. And to David's point about how little this was talked about outside of limited English proficient communities and families, I remember early on, we got a little bit of attention with these protests. I remember Brian Lair invited me and a couple of the women who were doing the organizing and Make the Road onto his show. And Brian Lair is not like a hawkish conservative, but he literally could not believe it. I mean, he just kept saying, but what you're saying is obviously untrue. There's no possible way in a neighborhood where 90% of the people speak Spanish in the home that the emergency room in that very neighborhood, they're unable to communicate with people in Spanish. He was literally flabbergasted, couldn't believe it. After David and other hospitals signed kind of those corrective action agreements or resolutions, Brian Lair felt so bad about how he had essentially mocked us as being deluded on air that he invited us back and apologized for what he didn't know. But of course, all we know is what we know and what we see. But we were able, David and the folks at Wyckoff took one approach, which was immediate communication and constructive engagement. Other hospitals had very different responses. Some very legalistic and confrontational. I remember, and then some people just were very shocked by the whole situation and didn't really know what to do. And I remember at the time, I guess it was the head of the Health and Hospitals Corporation, a guy named Ben Chu. I think he's a Chinese American immigrant. A good and capable guy, came to a meeting at Make the Road to talk to folks, and was so flabbergasted and flustered by having to sit there and listen to 30 or so community members recount stories of mistreatment or lack of services at Woodhull Hospital. He threw his papers in the air and left, with women literally running after him saying, "Dr. Chu, you didn't let me finish." And he went to his black car that the city provided. And I think it was just, he was not used to doing that much listening in his encounters with community residents. Eventually, HHC ended up resolving the problems. And as David said, and I know this is for later in the panel, we were able to move from a hospital by hospital approach, which was exhausting because we did Wyckoff, Woodhull, Brooklyn Hospital, Jamaica Hospital, Columbia Presbyterian, Beth Israel, before we started reaching for kind of system-wide solutions. And the same thing happened in the healthcare setting as it did in the administration of government agency setting, where Mayor Bloomberg eventually signed an executive order mandating not just welfare centers, but the Department of Education and all city agencies that engage with the public to provide interpretation and translation services. Similarly, that was one at the state level around hospitals. I think that it's a powerful example of how standing up for yourself and doing it in a strategic way that invites others in to do it with you can be powerful and can be effective at moving an agenda forward. But it was challenging at times, and it took a leap of faith, I think, on the part of folks who had only perceived bureaucracies and systems as hostile to their interest, to see that engaging with those same systems could actually lead to and foster deeper mutual understanding, and then an evolution of the practices of those institutions. And with that, I will pass it back to David. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I did unmute myself. So that was a wonderful walk down memory lane, and you reminded me of some things that I haven't thought about in decades. At the end of the process, we'll talk about this in our panel discussion, Alan Aviles led the final response from the New York City Health and Hospitals Corporation that I think was a positive contribution to the systemic reforms that occurred. But right now, let us turn, hold on. Let us turn next to Jorge Rivera, who, in addition to being a graduate of our bioethics program, is a fellow of the Northwell Health Bioethics Fellowship Program, and did that work right up until he took on his legislative role in the counsel's office to the Senate Majority Leader in the New York State Senate. And I've asked Jorge to do, really, frankly, what is the hardest work of our little get-together today. And that is to look at what has been done, what has been tried, and what has not been achieved in a legislative response, and Jorge, I hope you'll say something about the transcript of the public hearing you found, where both Andrew and I had forgotten about this. Both of us testified at a legislative hearing on interpretation services. So Jorge, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you for inviting me to speak tonight. I'll just get to the legislative piece. The first instance of language assistance services requirements in the state's legal space came really from the Department of Health regulations. And generally, the Department of Health has oversight authority over hospitals in New York, and that's true across all states. As part of that oversight authority, they can require what is called minimum standards to operate. And these standards cover everything from construction to patient care, the provision of certain services, the composition and training of medical staff. This is a very expansive authority that's also informed by a lot of federal requirements. And before I get into the historical piece of this in terms of legislative efforts, I do want to thank the legislative library folks here at the New York State Capitol, because they are amazing and they were really instrumental in finding all the information that I'm about to discuss. And I also want to caveat, I'm solely focusing on hospitals, of course, as we traditionally understand them, but there are similar legal requirements for facilities that service individuals living with mental health and disabilities. There's network adequacy requirements for certain health plans. There's, like plans have to ensure, for example, beneficiaries access to culturally and linguistically competent care. There's also mandates to provide specific information at different points in care continuum or particular settings, et cetera. It's kind of comprehensive in a way legislatively. But one of the first instances of legislative concern with language assistance services was back in 1977, when a bill was introduced in the Assembly by Assemblymember Proud, requiring hospitals to provide language interpreters. That was it. They allowed the Department of Health to kind of establish those guidelines regarding this new mandate, but nothing really happened with the bill. And a decade later, we're now in 1988, the Department of Health adopted regulations with the minimum standards for hospitals, and in response to federal minimum standards for participation that were established 2 years before by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And in those standards from 1988, the Department of Health required state hospitals to manage a resource of interpreters. That service had to be regularly available for non-English speaking groups, making more than 1% of the total hospital service area population. It had to be available within 20 minutes or 10 minutes if it's an emergency service, within the request. And, they had to have dedicated staff to answer questions regarding this right, and they had to provide information to patients on how to access language assistance services. And they had to provide in-service training to all patient care staff to make sure that they all understood the requirements of the regulation. And mind you, this is 1988, right? Fast forward to 2003, and David and Andrew spoke to this. We have the Wyckoff resolution agreement. And, again, it required the language assistant coordinator, the policies and procedures, having bilingual staff and other forms of resources like telephonic interpreters, training on medical interpretation for that dedicated staff, and again, informing patients, having a complaint procedure, translation of key documents, and monitoring and reporting requirements. And that same year, the New York Assembly passed a bill that died in the Senate, meaning it didn't pass, requiring hospitals to provide language assistance services to patients with limited English proficiency. And again, it had mostly the same requirements that we've discussed in the past few minutes, but it also required, to have the service available at all times, to be provided in person to the extent practicable, and notification of service to patients, and again, reporting and documentation. Nothing, again, mostly the same requirements in a way. And, you know, the bill sponsor argued while debating the bill that it was essential because the primary driver was the increasing population of immigrants with limited English proficiency, and how this demographic shift had led to a range of issues, including higher risk for clinical consequences caused by errors because of untrained interpreters, like family members and children, for example, and how these interpretation errors directly resulted in the mistakes, placing a lot of burden on healthcare institutions and leading to a rise in misdiagnoses. And you know, they had a lot of evidence suggesting that hospitals nationwide were kind of failing to consistently provide those services, with a lot of cultural kind of incompetence and limited access, posing, of course, obstacles to equitable healthcare. And you know, at the end of that same year, 2003, the Assembly Committees on Health and the Task Force on New Americans convened a public hearing regarding interpretation and translation in hospitals. And while the chairs kind of recognized there were federal and state laws and regulations already requiring hospitals to make that service available for patients with limited English proficiency, the advocates were arguing that these requirements were not really effective, and they had to be at least modified in some way. And you know, the hearing also focused on the bill we just discussed and another companion bill requiring Medicaid to pay for interpretation services. And I'll get back to that in a moment. But you know, a lot of comments in the hearing range from support for the bill, you know, making distinctions on how it was better than current requirements, also opposition to the bill since it was duplicative of current requirements, or you know, restating the same obligations and administratively burdensome in a way, or just call to refocus the Assembly's energy to training existing clinicians on best practices regarding language assistance services. After the hearing, you know, the Assembly kind of reintroduced the bills requiring language assistance services and Medicaid to pay for those services. And the Senate introduced identical bills, and you know, they've been reintroduced every legislative session since, and you know, they haven't really been passed in a meaningful way in a way. Going forward to 2006, 3 years after the hearing, the Department of Health updated its regulations regarding language assistance services. And since then, they really haven't changed. And this is what we have today. For example, the regulations require hospitals to have the language assistance program to ensure meaningful access, to have a language assistance coordinator to manage and oversee the provision of those services, to have materials available to all that summarize the process and the method of the services, policies and procedures, ongoing education and training for administrative and clinical staff to understand what is culturally and linguistically competent service delivery looks like and how to access those language assistance services on behalf of patients, to have signs regarding the availability of free language assistance services in every location and public location in the hospital, and to identify the preference and language needs of each patient when they come into the hospital and to document it in the medical record, and to the extent possible, to avoid using family members, friends, and non-hospital personnel as interpreters unless the patient agrees to it. They refuse the interpreter services, and there is an issue with, you know, confidentiality, conflicts of interest, you know, et cetera. But all in all, at least somebody should be 16 years of age or older. And if they are younger than 16 years, it should be really in an emergency situation. You know, and again, we see the same things, have interpreters available within 20 minutes of a request if they're inpatient, or 10 minutes if it's an emergency, and to use every demographic information to identify the speaking groups that are, you know, more than 1% of the total hospital service area population. And you know, as you can see, this is very close to what the workup settlement required, what regulations already mandated before, and what the bills are trying to enshrine in statute in a way. I do want to talk about, you know, take a second to talk about Medicaid reimbursement, because a big component of this is money, or just resources in general, of course. And you know, while states are not really required to reimburse providers for the cost of language services, they do have the option to claim federal Medicaid matching funds or reimbursement for the cost of those interpretation services. And there's like a whole formula for this, right? And New York has been claiming this reimbursement since 2012 and for inpatient and outpatient settings. And, I've quickly just finally wanted to address the question that we do get a lot, is why certain bills don't move. And there's a host of reasons, right? It may be because there's something already currently in law or regulation, in a way it's duplicative, right? And maybe we should be focusing more on the enforcement of those statutes, right? Or it might be because the legislature just needs more time to analyze the issues and to get feedback from relevant stakeholders. There could be some political issue that needs sensitivity, or it might be simply because we don't have, we have a very limited amount to pass certain bills and sometimes not enough manpower to do it. I think, David, if you could just put this slide for a second, just to kind of underscore what I'm saying, right? In the slide that you're looking at, just to put it into perspective, you can see the number of bills that get introduced every year, like over 15,000 bills, right? And you can also see the total number of bills that actually make it to the finish line, or less than 1,000 or even 1,000, right? And it might seem like a small number, but the amount of work that goes into each bill, from the conception of an idea to writing it, analyzing it, getting feedback, amending it, going through committee, conferencing so members give us feedback or just to understand what they're voting on, and then debating, passing it, finally sending it to the governor's desk for more negotiation or just to sign or veto it, can only yield that much time. Right? And there's a lot, in a way, there's a lot of work that happens on the back end that not a lot of people are aware of. So it's sometimes not an issue of not being a priority, is that there's only so much time. And that's more or less the legislative history that we have here in New York. As you see, a very short legislative history.
And we should point out, Jorge, that in recent years, I've lost track of how long it's been, the legislature at the state level, the Senate and the Assembly, are both under firm control of the Democrats. And that has not changed significantly the amount of legislation that gets through the process. And I should add, both houses of the legislature and the governor's mansion. And yet legislation moves slowly because there are lots of competing interests. So Jorge, thank you. That was remarkable. I think our participants in this webinar should come away from your presentation appreciating that it's been a long road, but there's a lot more that can be accomplished as long as there's pressure on the legislature to make it a priority. And why should more change and improvement be a priority? Well, you're going to hear about that from Tracy Koss in just a moment. But for those of you who are seeking CLE credit for tonight's webinar, please write down the first participation code, which you'll have to put on the form that will be emailed to everyone after this session is over. But lawyers will have to have the two codes. This one, interpreter, doesn't have to be capitalized, doesn't matter. Spelling doesn't count. And at the end of the program, we'll have the second participation code, and we will move on from there. So I was thrilled to get introduced to Tracy Koss as I was organizing this session, because I quite literally didn't know anyone who had come into the profession of medical and particularly hospital-based interpretation in recent years. So my experience with the development of training standards is now 20 plus years old, and it's changed a lot and for the better. So Tracy, please tell us how interpretation looks 20 years after the settlement agreement that Andrew and I entered into on the ground, if you would.
Thank you, David, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to shine a light on the important work that medical interpreters do. I've been a CMI Spanish French, which means a certified medical interpreter, for just about a year and a half now. And I've been also volunteering about 10 hours a week for that same amount of time for a major New York City hospital for, as I said, for about a year and a half as well. And I thought I would start by first going over exactly what it means to be a medical interpreter. As you said, even though it might seem overly simplistic or basic, I found that one of the biggest barriers to my work being efficient is that I know what it's like to be a medical interpreter and what the expectations should be and what my code of ethics is, but I feel that often, obviously, patients don't, so I establish that as much as I can, time permitting, from the get-go, but I feel that a lot of providers don't know that, so it's like it's a new experience every time I walk into the room if I've never worked with the provider before. So very basic, the governing body that sets the rules and regulations and the standards and best practices for in medical interpretation is the IMIA, which is the International Medical Interpreters Association. And I believe that there are two certifications that the IMIA recognizes. The first is a CMI, which is what I am, and that's a certification from the National Board of Certified Medical Interpreters. And the second is a CHI, which is a certified healthcare interpreter, and that comes from the CCHI, which is the Certification Commission for Healthcare Interpreters. So as I said, I'm a CMI, and so I thought maybe I'd tell you what is required for me to have, what was required for me to get the certification. You have to be 18 years of age or older. You have to have a GED or higher education. It requires a certification, a certificate from 40 hours of a medical interpretation training certificate from an accredited program or from a college or university program. Obviously, it requires proof of proficiency in both English and the target language. Once you submit all of that to the governing board, they will allow you or not to pass a written exam. And if you are allowed to pass the exam or to take the exam, you must get a 75% or greater to pass. And if you pass that exam, you can then sign up for a written exam, for an oral exam, which you must get a 70% or greater to pass. This exam, everything is done online. It's very obscure, a very archaic process. I can guarantee that most people don't do well because of the electronics, not because of their language skills. It's something that's very, very foreign and unlike reality or real life in any medical setting whatsoever. CMIs have to renew their certification every 5 years, and to do so, it requires completing 30 hours of CEUs. As David mentioned, interpretation deals with the spoken language in real time. There are two forms, either consecutive or simultaneous, and translation focuses on the written content. By and large, medical interpreters are trained in consecutive interpretation. Consecutive interpretation differs from simultaneous, which is what we would normally see in a court setting or what you might have seen or at the UN, in that there's an oral message that comes from the source, so the provider or the patient. It's interpreted into the target language by the interpreter, obviously there are pauses between the messaging, and then the response is therefore interpreted back, and it goes back and forth. So I bother making this differentiation because they require a very different skill set and also pacing. So medical interpreters are not though we are listening very attentively and taking notes, we do need some time to process the information and allow for the conversation to actually seem more natural. If you go into a simultaneous interpretation, it becomes a little bit one-sided. And so in that way, I believe that a consecutive interpretation better supports the main tenet of our practice, which is enhancing the therapeutic relationship between provider and patient. So my mission as a medical interpreter is to accurately render what is being said between all parties. It used to be a triad mostly, or that's how we are taught, but every room I've entered in the hospital setting has at least 3 medical students, a patient care specialist, someone else observing, obviously the attending, a hospitalist. So a lot of what we learn gets set aside, and the positioning, we just have to be flexible and try to maintain the code of ethics as best we can in the setting that we have. So we do that to ensure that we ensure delivery and quality of healthcare. The code of ethics that we abide by include confidentiality, of course, accuracy and completeness, so accurately conveying the content and spirit of the original message, which allows for full transparency for the patient to know what's actually being spoken in the room, whether it be to the patient, of the patient, about the patient. I always try to remember that sometimes there are sidebar conversations happening, but if the patient were an English speaker, the patient would be privy to that information and able to process it or use it to have better agency over their healthcare or make decisions. So that's something that's I have to remind providers all the time. We abide by impartiality, which means we remain neutral and non-judgmental. This includes speaking of ourselves in the third person. So when we interpret as if we were the provider and the patient. And when we have a question as me, Tracy, I speak of myself as the interpreter and in the third person. We respect boundaries in both the professional and cultural frameworks. And the last point, which I feel is the one that's the most, so it's advocacy, which Andrew spoke about before, and so did Jorge in what interpreters do, but the National Board of Certified Medical Interpreters defines it as an action taken on behalf of individuals that goes beyond facilitating communication with the intention of supporting good health outcomes. And I find that advocacy was not focused enough in my training. I do a lot of advocacy, I think because of the population I work with. I'm in a hospital setting. I do rounds with the medical teams in the pediatric ICU as well as the NICU. And I find that the population I'm dealing the most with, obviously I'm speaking with the parents, not the children, unless it's a teenager that can communicate for himself or herself. But a lot of these families are new to New York City. They're migrant families. They live in shelters. They don't understand the process. And so there are some very subtle nonverbal cues that one might get from when they ask a question. It actually does not just require an answer. It actually might have, if you pull the thread, it might unravel a whole other set of needs that are not being addressed that would help their condition or their healthcare, the care they're getting. So how does one access interpretation services? Jorge also went over this a little bit before, but medical interpreters might be requested directly by patients who are familiar with their rights, but more often than not, they do not know what their rights are. I will say that American Sign Language also falls under the umbrella of the language assistance programs in most hospitals. And the deaf community is very well aware of their rights, or more aware than limited English proficiency patients. And so so they might know to request an in-person or any kind of interpretation, but most often than not, medical providers are the ones that will jot down language preference, and in a hospital setting would be from the very beginning, LEP patients should be asked at every step of the way. So from intake to discharge, they should be asked at any time they're getting care if they would like interpretation services. And as Jorge said, they might decline them, and that is all noted and documented. And in the hospital where I work, as I'm assuming all hospitals, it is audited regularly. Interpretation services are available for in-person or face-to-face or on-site, however you want to call them. There are also video remote interpreters that are available on every floor and almost in every corner of the hospitals, which are iPads that are like little robots that can be wheeled around. And also phone interpretation or telephone interpretation is available 24/7. And you can, with the remote interpreters, providers can access, I think, any language in the world 24/7. And at the hospital where I work, every provider has a little card that they attach to their badge, and the instructions for how to contact at any time of day, whether it be to schedule an in-person appointment or a phone call, they can call directly, and all the instructions are there. So there should never be a reason not to have an interpreter available. So the second half of the question was, how is it working, and what's the interpreter's perspective? So I believe that using medical interpreters in any form has proven to have a positive impact in so many ways. It's been measured that it reduces clinical errors due to misunderstandings or misinterpretations from janitorial staff, someone who's took Spanish 1 in high school. That still happens, but that we're there to avoid that. And fortunately and unfortunately, a lot of people in New York City know just enough Spanish to get in trouble. So they should always rely on us. It also increases patient autonomy and agency over their healthcare. And also it has been proven to increase patients' compliance to what the doctor orders. As a volunteer myself, as a volunteer medical interpreter, I chose to work exclusively in person because I love using the Spanish language, and that's why I was looking for ways to use the language in a way of servicing my community. And I appreciate how my language skills has helped me connect with people and support them, especially when they're at their most vulnerable. And I find that in-person interpretations have a humanitarian impact that there's a basic one in just speaking someone's language or someone being understood that, of course, the remote interpretation allows. But there's something that happens in person that's very important and also transformative, often not just for the patient, but for myself as well. In complex cases are often assigned an in-person interpreter, which is understandable. There's time usually for a family meeting or for a need that's established in advance. So, for example, it could be crisis intervention, trauma patients, working with the elderly who are hard of hearing or just elderly, working with children, patient education and demonstrations. All of those are better served when in person. And sometimes just having a human presence is necessary. As I mentioned, I work in the pediatric ICU, And having parents, when they are scared and they feel alone and they see someone in person who there's the human aspect to it, who can understand them, and you can see sometimes they relax. One patient has told me, or parent has told me, when I see you, my blood pressure goes down, and that they finally feel seen and heard. The complaint we hear the most when a parent of speaking another language, or an LEP parent, the complaint we hear the most as part of the patient experience is that they feel neglected. And so just having someone be able to communicate absolutely everything and understand them in person, and then see that the facial expressions and the humanity makes a world of difference. That's it.
Wow, is all I can say, Tracy. It's remarkable. I'm sure Andrew has the same reaction, how far we've gotten in 20 years in terms of what it means to be a well-trained, clinically competent professional interpreter, whether paid or volunteer. And I think there is need for more academic research on how well interpretation services are being supplied across the country. So much to do, and lots of questions that we'll get to in our panel discussion in a moment. So thank you.
Thank you.
And next up, Joyita. And Joyita, I think I always mispronounce your last name, but I'm going to try, and please correct me. Dastidar?
Yes,
Did we get close?
you got it.
Oh, good. Having spent a lot of time in my career in neighborhoods that are incredibly ethnically diverse, I've really come to enjoy learning at least how to pronounce names. We'll talk about this in the panel discussion, because somebody asked a question about whether all healthcare workers should be trained to speak another language. Yes, I wish that it could be the case, but I tried. We had Spanish classes out at Wyckoff, and I went dutifully twice a week, and it just, something wrong with my brain. But more on that later. So Joyita, what I want you to share with our audience is, how does this work when you speak the language that is the patient's preferred language? And how do you experience taking care of patients when they speak a language you don't speak? So please, take us on your journey.
Sure. I did want to clarify one point to begin with. You had said I was a native Spanish speaker, and I'm actually not. I took Spanish, I think I was trying to remember, because someone asked me recently, I think maybe starting in late elementary school or early junior high. I had wanted to take French, but fortunately my parents made me take Spanish. And then I did a lot of rotations in South and Central America, medical rotations during medical school and residency. So
Okay.
my other native language other than English is actually Bengali, but I would say that I feel more comfortable using Spanish in the hospital setting versus Bengali, just because I've been using Spanish day in and day out at work every single day. One other thing I will mention, and it kind of is related to the comment that Tracy made about, we shouldn't have providers who have level 1 Spanish, like took a semester not using interpreters, and I absolutely 100% agree with that. And one of the initiatives that has come out of NYP recently is a push for healthcare professionals who are using any language other than English at work with their patients to go through kind of a formal screening process to say, yes, you have the level of fluency required to not use an interpreter, and in whatever XYZ language that you want to test out of. And if you don't pass that, then you have to use an interpreter. I think that's very good, like important objective measure of whether someone should be using, another language or not in their clinical practice. And then and related to that, there is kind of a QI, quality improvement initiative, about interpreter services that's being run actually by two of the hospitalists in my group. One of them was a Spanish interpreter. He worked as an interpreter for a while before he went to medical school. And another is like a hospitalist interested in QI who's a native Spanish speaker. And that initiative is looking at the top of the notes, like it's really important to document for patients who are not native English speakers, the use of an interpreter, or if you didn't, specifically why you did not use them. So the most common reason would be, you know, they were offered, I'm a native speaker or fluent speaker, and the family declined the interpreter services. Another thought like that comes up in clinical practice is I do think it's important to, when you walk into the room, to ask the patient if, you know, what language they prefer. And by that, I mean specifically, you shouldn't presume that someone is not a fluent English speaker just based on their appearances. I personally had an experience where I went into the hospital with my kiddo, and the ED doctor walked in and said Espanol, and I mean I could have spoken in Spanish back, but it was just it's I think it's great that and positive thing to want to speak in patient's native language, but there are people who are, you know, born and raised in the US or immigrated at a young enough age where they're fluent in English, and I think it can be a little offensive to walk in and just presume Spanish, even if, you know, 99% chance you're probably right. I do always ask the patient beforehand.
Right.
And then for those who are, let's say, most often for me, and because I work at Columbia, it's who are, you know, who require Spanish as their language of communication. You kind of like what Tracy was saying, you see this immediate like relief once they realize that you can communicate directly. With Spanish, like or with any language, you do offer interpreters. I have noticed, like including for patients for languages that I don't speak, the patient often prefers the family be the interpreter, and that's their prerogative as long as they were offered an interpreter and they chose to decline those services. I've thought a few times, like, why do they prefer that? I think it's a combination of maybe privacy and or at the same time, like updating the patient's family about, you know, clinical developments or answering questions, so they get kind of 2 for 1. I think oftentimes it's a combination. And again, like as long as they were offered the services and they chose to decline them, that's fine. But they are aware that that's always available, like with every interaction. Another thing I will add is if someone's a native speaker or a fluent speaker, I think there is a greater sense of trust just innately because of that whole component of like I know that they understand what I'm saying, and I don't have to go through like an intermediary, because sometimes I think most of our interpreter services are excellent. I don't know how it works at other places, but like sometimes there's just a concern, or I've had experiences, rarely, less and less so, I'd say, over time, where the patient will say like 2 paragraphs and I get like 1 sentence back. And again, this is a rarity, especially I haven't had anything like that in, I'd say, years now, but I think for reasons like that, there are issues about, you know, trust and what is everything being communicated appropriately. And thankfully, like with the interpreter societies having all these their own ethical standards and education, again, that isn't an occurrence that I've had recently at any time recently, but I have had it, like I'd say, been in practice for a while, so over a decade ago. That definitely happened more than once. Another thing is that I'd just like to mention is it's very scary to be a patient in general if you're fluent in English. Like being in a hospital it's a very scary experience, and then to add to that level of uncertainty, like I don't understand what you know my doctors are saying to me, or I don't know if they understand what I'm trying to say. That just makes it so like exponentially so much scarier. So that's why it's so important to have interpreter services available and use them all the time. It does, when I think about why I'm like my coworkers or anyone would maybe not use an interpreter service, it's not a very good reason. I think it just comes down to it takes much longer, and the bottom line is, like, if you have a patient who speaks a different language than what you speak, it is going to take more time. You're just going to have to factor that in. But it's not a good reason. I think everyone would agree it's not a good reason. So that should never be why someone wouldn't use an interpreter. There's like urban legend stories of a doctor saying something, using their phone with Google Translate and walking in and playing it back to the patient and then walking out. I hope that never happens, but it's horrific. Like, it's a horrific urban legend. And then another thing I will mention, like, I guess I'll close with, because we are running a little bit short on time,
We're
but
doing fine. No.
okay.
We have a late start, so don't rush. We have plenty of time.
Okay. One thing that comes up, one ethical issue that comes up in my clinical practice is, I think patients who are semi-fluent, not fluent, I'd say, I forget what the term, proficient in English, or even maybe even a little bit less. Sometimes they will want to use English as the language of communication. I think sometimes it's because they're worried that, or it's a way of showing that they're kind of, and I'm obviously just guessing, like, integrated into society, and they're worried that maybe they will get less care or not as good care if they're using an interpreter. And so it comes up with me, like, where I offer an interpreter, if it's a language I don't, I'm not fluent in, and the patient declines the interpreter, but then it becomes clear during the discussion that we do need an interpreter. So what do you do then? And I don't want to, like, offend the patient by not listening to them.
Right.
And my workaround then is I'll, like, do the interaction the way they want to, and then later I'll come back and I'll either already have the interpreter on the phone, so it's not, like, obvious that I'm not honoring their wishes, or if it's, for example, one of the languages that I am fluent in, I'll do the same thing. I'll do it in English first go around, and then I'll come back an hour or two, or whenever I can after I'm done with doing my first pass at rounds, and do it in their language. I like, obviously, honoring a patient's wishes, but when it comes down to, I'm not really sure that they understand what I'm saying by honoring their wishes. I think obviously just the truth or the facts take precedence in that case, especially because if we don't have the facts or the story right, it can negatively affect their care. And I'll close with, two more points. One is that the mode of interpreter does make a difference sometimes. So we use over the phone, but it's very institutional. So where I was before in Michigan, we had like a whole cadre of in-person interpreters, which was wonderful. We had them in Spanish and in Arabic because Dearborn was nearby. So those were the two most often spoke non-English languages spoken in the hospital. And I loved having an in-person interpreter. I think also for, like, especially weighty conversations, I would make the effort to try to get an in-person interpreter. Here at NYP, it's harder to get an in-person interpreter. The ER does have a bay where there are in-person Spanish interpreters, which is helpful for ED admissions if someone needs a Spanish interpreter. But otherwise on the floor, it's actually a little bit of a process to get an in-person interpreter. You have to request it like a day in advance, and then it's like the unit assistant has to put in a request, and it usually will come through if you put it in far ahead enough in advance, but it's not like you can just ask for one and you have it right away. We do obviously have 24/7 access to the phone interpreter, and it's almost every language is covered, but we have had instances of very rare, unusual dialects where it took days to find someone, and that was obviously less than ideal. But those are far and few between as well. And then there have been, and some people respond differently to different types of interpreters too. So I had a patient, non-English speaking, who was originally came in with catatonia, and as they were getting treatment, were improving and kind of starting to become verbal, but still wasn't saying that much. And we were using an over the phone interpreter. And then once we switched to a video interpreter, which I'd say is like in between in terms of ideal is in person and phone is the least ideal, but video is kind of a middle ground. The change in communication was remarkable. She just started, she wasn't talking like paragraphs, but she started talking notably more and like waving and smiling and saying hi, just because we did have a face with the voice. I think sometimes just the voice coming out of nowhere can be a little bit like discombobulated. And the final point that I will end with is like an ethics related case that came up, and also language related, where I had a colleague who was taking care of a patient. It was a relatively young woman, and who was not an English speaker at all. And her husband was acting as the interpreter, and was also, I think, with the goal of trying to protect her, was limiting what information was being passed along. And they were refusing an interpreter. So the question became, is this ethical to withhold, that the husband is withholding information from the patient, who is the wife? And in ethics, like, a patient can choose that their family member is filtering what they receive, but you have to have that conversation where they say, yes, this is the way I want it to be. It cannot be like that the family member makes an executive decision to withhold that information. And I understand that there is a huge cultural component to that, because in the US, like, autonomy is kind of king or queen, whereas in other cultures there is more of a family sense, where there might be someone who's the patriarch, like making, or the matriarch, like making decisions on behalf of the younger folks or whatnot. So in that case, it was a language that I'm a fluent speaker. And so they brought me in, and I basically just asked that question. They brought me in kind of like, oh, here's someone who speaks your language. We just wanted, them to meet you. But I was able to kind of ask those questions of the patient, like, you're not, whatever information you're getting it through your husband. Are you okay with that? Or do you want us to present you with all of the facts? And in that case, the patient did choose that they wanted to keep it that way. And then we and that they did want their husband to be the interpreter. So then we proceeded as we had been, but at least now with kind of, I'd say, more of a clear conscience, knowing that whatever withholding of, facts, medical facts or information that was going on was sanctioned by the patient. So it's important to, like, follow the platinum rule and not the golden rule, like, do unto others as they want to have done, not necessarily as you would have done unto you. So with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Wow, Joy, that was fascinating. The number of questions that have been coming in that we're going to get to in our discussion have been voluminous and remarkable for their specificity and clarity. This is quite an audience that we've assembled, and thank you all for participating with us. So we are going to move on to the patient perspective, which I saved for last purposefully, because it's important for us, whether we are lawyers or clinicians of any stripe, to understand what our responsibilities are, so that we can understand what is being perceived by the patients, who are our responsibility and our customers in a commercial sense. And they don't have a responsibility to know what good interpretation ought to look like. They only have a responsibility to make their needs known. And so we're going to turn now to Didi Sanchez to answer the sort of thorny question, which I know Didi will handle with the utmost delicacy. And the question is, how does the community around, in this case, our hospital, New York Presbyterian Columbia University Irving Medical Center, but it's true for every single hospital in America, probably around the world. How do the patients perceive what's done well and what really needs improvement from the patient's perspective? So Didi, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I will try my best to answer as best as I can. But I am happy that I went after Joita, because I think you said a lot of what the participants of the research study that I managed, the things that they experience day to day. The patient perspective that I'm going to speak about today is that of research participants that are growing old in the communities of North Manhattan. And as they're growing old, because we enroll them at 65 years of age. And I always say they're growing because they're not aging. And as you will see, I think, Tracy, you had, there was a talk about, interpretation and translating. And one of the things that I've noticed is the way that we describe different processes is different from a patient perspective and from a provider perspective. So one of the things that I've come to learn over the years, 20 years working here, is that even how they describe their experience is different than I myself as a research scientist or as a someone who is providing services to them actually understand it. And that has been very humbling to me over the years. And I'll start first with, I think there was a question about translators versus interpreters. And I've learned that interpreter is the correct word, but somehow that does not stick. So, when I hear stories about their experiences, and I think, Joita, I think you've hit them all right on the nail. I will say that the first thing is like, oh, when they translated for me, or when I went, to the emergency room, and their experiences between, emergency services versus inpatient care versus outpatient care, and what it meant for them to either have limited English proficiency or to have someone there to interpret or translate, and the outcomes, right? So that's one of the first things that I've noticed, the differences in not only modality, which is, it could be voice, right? Audio, in person, but what felt more comfortable or what felt more culturally appropriate. Awareness. So one of the things that I do, the first thing is make them aware of these services. So the first thing is, a lot of times they don't know that this is a required, right? That given that this hospital is required by law to provide meaningful patient care, that one of those is interpretation. And, when I tell, for example, I'm going to show a clip of a interaction between a mom, a parent, a child, and a doctor. One of the first things that I hear between even adult children, meaning teenagers, is, I wish I've known, the services were there, because of the burden that it carries, both emotional and just not knowing whether they're going to get the words right. So if you would see with me and follow along, I'm going to show a very small clip. This is a two-time Emmy Award winner director, Rudy Valdez. This is called, again, Translators or Traductores, and it's a documentary short depicting the experience of Latino children as they translate for the parents who have limited language proficiency.
Ready?
Yes.
Uy, no, un besito, un besito. Un besito. Ay, no.
Está en la mesa, por favor.
Puño. ¿Ustedes a qué edad la van a dejar tener un celular?
A los 25. No, carajo.
Si no la operan, ¿se puede empeorar en un futuro?
Claro, mi amor, porque ya casi no escuchan. Por eso es que te necesitamos para que todo salga bien, mi amor.
¿Has visto hoy?
Hoy,
Sí, es persona.
tú te sientes muy... ¿Tú crees que es una responsabilidad muy grande para ti?
Ay, bastante, vaya a ver.
Es que la responsabilidad, haz de cuenta que estás en cualquier lugar normalito.
Sí, pero papi, vamos a hablar de una cirugía, es como más.
Es cuando más valor.
Y es algo,
Bueno, tú sabes
más
que
valor y
tu
más
hermana
fuerza de
y algo
de
también
todo.
porque, ¿qué tal si yo me equivoco diciendo algo?
No, mi amor, no te vas a equivocar. Tú tienes que ser positiva. Tienes que ser positiva y tienes que decir todo va a salir bien. Ah, bueno, no, tenían tantas preguntas y por eso quise venir.
She said she had a lot of questions, that's why she wants to come over here.
Porque en el colegio también me dicen que tiene problemas de habla porque parece que no escucha bien. Debe ser eso, ¿cierto?
She said that in her school, they're gonna put her in a program because she can't talk that well. she can speak.
Well,
that.
that'll definitely help, but the
Dice que-
fluid in the ears is, she hears like she's underwater.
Dice que el flujo en sus oídos hace como si ella escuchara que estuviera debajo del agua. Oh.
Did she get all her questions answered?
¿Tuvo todas sus preguntas tuvieron la respuesta? Sí.
No tengo una, dile que si me puede regalar esta silla porque es la forma de entretenerla.
He said that you can give her that chair.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I think that we saw a lot of what Tracy and Yoida was talking about, just, in terms of what questions are being asked, right? I mean, as you saw, there was no cut in the video, but it seemed there's a big space. Did she really understand, what was being asked, of her? Did she understand what it meant for her to hear like she was underwater, right? Did the mom want to ask more questions? What was the interaction between both the provider or the physician and the parent? And you can just kind of sense the burden and the fear of the daughter, right? And making sure that she get everything right. I mean, it's a lot of times we hear all these things, but when we see it in person, that's when we understand, what's at stake, the difference between patient outcomes. And, do we feel comfortable asking all the questions that, that would help us, determine, okay, what's best for, the patient or my daughter. So I just, wanted to show that. And, as you would be shocked to hear that there's 11 million children in the United States who are language brokers, right? Who are, ad hoc interpreters. And
yeah, Didi, the line that really just got me in the gut was when the mother said to the older daughter, "You'll be fine, just stay optimistic."
Right.
Talk about pressure.
Yes, exactly. And like I said, wouldn't she have loved to know that there was Tracy, out there fulfilling that role? And that's exactly what happens, in the cohort that I work for. There's a lot. I was just talking to the panel before we started about, the loss of language as people get older, and not necessarily develop dementia, but those who, slowly lose their second language. I may be one of those persons, right? I immigrated here. My first language was Spanish. I find myself that emotionally, I tend to communicate more in Spanish, that I find that I can connect more. Will I be one of those persons who, later on, as I grow older, that, that I say, I want to communicate in my language, but I don't want it to be through my daughter, right? Because what if it's cancer? What if it's, something else? And I'll stress also what Joida said, that it does feel sometimes that there's a hierarchy of who speaks Spanish as a provider and who doesn't, right? So you feel, am I getting the best care if I see not to say that a resident, but that's usually how you feel when you go into an academic medical institution. Who are the ones who are speaking, who can speak, my language? And am I going to see the head of the department, and what does that care going to look like? Although the care may be the same, but there's a perception that it's not. And how is that going to impact the care that I seek? So I think there's a lot of questions that, and legally as well, how do you know that your patient is really, getting the care that they understand? So, as the population grows older, and Spanish speaking residents, in United States are more apt to get dementia. So what's going to happen then when we ourselves are not aware of what's happening, and that we now need medical interpreters?
Well, this is a good moment, as I like to say in class, for a deep breath, because we've absorbed a lot of material that's really very important and frankly is news to me, and I'm sure to many of you. So let's take a quick, brief pause for the second participation code, which is translator. So we had interpreter and translator as our participation codes. And I'm now going to stop that. And let's break into our panel discussion, because we have so many questions and so many really remarkable questions that I fear, even though I thought I allowed lots of extra time, maybe I didn't allow enough. But let's dive in. So we've addressed the question that was first raised about these terms, interpreter and translator. One participant raised the point that I misidentified this as being verbal, and I should have said oral. And that raises an important point. Yes, oral is the more technically accurate descriptor for spoken words, but oral also has homonym meanings. And part of what we do in dealing with interpretation services, even within a single language, is try to be careful that our words are clear. Let me say, by the way, just because I have the prerogative, that I find the most important and interesting questions in LEP services are the ethical questions and not the clinical questions or the linguistic questions. And the reason is very simple. Every level of communication ability is important. In an emergency, even if you only speak high school Spanish, that can be a lifesaver. The critical dimension of the use of whatever language skills you have is to know what your limitations are, and to know your limitations both as a bilingual person. I remember, for example, when I first met Andrew, I was completely blown away, not just at his fluency in Spanish, but expecting that he had spoken Spanish his entire life, from childhood, because that is his gift. And we have to make judgments about what a person's language skills are in a medical environment. That's an ethical judgment. I'm fond of saying that it doesn't matter if you say to the patient central pontine myelinolysis in English or in Spanish or in German, they're not going to understand what that means. And so, Tracy, I want to turn to you first. When physicians use highly technical phrases like central pontine myelinolysis that you may not understand, let alone be able to translate, what is your ethical responsibility?
The understanding for the patient is the responsibility. So what I would do is actually repeat the word as best I can in English and say, this is the word in English. And hopefully, which is a little bit of tainting but hopefully elicit a reaction like, what's that? And so often if I do also repeat it in English, the provider will notice that there's, or not, but it depends. I never lower the register because we're not supposed to, but if I feel that there's lack of understanding or that it's not going, there's an unspoken, or there's the nonverbal is that the patient isn't understanding, I will say interpreter would like clarification, and I would ask them to the provider to explain to me, so that then I can explain in a different way.
Excellent.
I actually, if I can also add,
Please.
I was just going to say, part of the reason I also described what is necessary, or what the qualifications or the certification requirements are, is that there are also limitations to this. So if I'm going to walk into, or I like knowing in advance what I'm going to walk into. It's not always possible, especially when doing rounds. But if I'm going to work with an LVAD patient, I read up and I study. I'm constantly studying. I was very excited last year to be a pulmonary expert, given RSV, COVID, and any other respiratory illness was in the pediatric ward, and I just was doing that all the time. But sometimes I'm, just come off the elevator and called in, and it's patient's last right with a spiritual care, and I have no warning, and it's not something medical, it's something so there's a lot that's put on us as well, and we're not doctors in every field, so we really should have some kind of we should study, and we should always be improving our practice, but so it has to be a partnership too, to be able to give the best rendering possible.
Mhm. Sure. The next question has to do with technology, and I'd really like to hear from all of you on this. The participant asks or states, I have found a lack of knowledge of the medical staff, parentheses, not all, mind you, on how to use the translator or interpreter services when those services are being used through audio-visual or just audio means. Where does technology appropriately fit? And where should we not use it as a crutch or as a convenience in lieu of a human interpreter? Anyone? And let me narrow the question to the specific circumstance of interpretation services in Spanish, the most common second language in hospitals, in my experience, and Serbo-Croatian or some obscure Middle Eastern dialect. Is there a difference in the appropriateness of using technology-based interpretation services?
I'll take that first, and I think I'm going to go back to the amazing Andrew. I think I remember your conversation about how the percentage of the persons in the community was so high compared to the the physicians in the hospital itself. I think it really serves that if you know that your patients are going to be more than likely speaking certain language, that you have an in-person, right? And of course, if you are, from a non-dominant community language, for you to have anything, more is better, right? So I'm saying if it's Croatia, and of course, if you have 20, just like the Alzheimer's Association, I'm sorry to plug that in, hotline, they have over 60 languages, available. So I think the same thing goes for the setting that you're in. I think that if your population is majority one language, that you should have the best. And if it's not, I think you should, it's, whatever you provide, it's great. I don't know if you have anything, Andrew, to say about that.
Other thoughts? Oh, Andrew, you're muted in case you were about to say something. Nope. Okay, good. Any thoughts about technology? I will say that the technology has improved so much that I think it has to be given a second look from a legal compliance and an ethical perspective. In the early days, in the 90s and 2000s, any sort of audiovisual translation was a huge rolling cart with these big televisions on it, and you could only plug the cables in a small handful of places. So it really wasn't an effective technology. Now the iPads, which can be everywhere and are wireless, I think they need to be given more consideration, because of course there is a cost benefit consideration to all of this. So I don't think we should be too quick to dismiss technology, but it shouldn't be a substitute for having some live human translation, at least in the most commonly spoken languages in a hospital's area. So the next question is a straight ethics question. So thank you, E. First initial. So is it wrong to ask someone to translate, meaning a family member or a friend, something for us? What is the correct question? For example, E quotes, could you interpret this for me, please? So what is the proper way of handling the potential of a family member serving as an interpreter?
I would say that it is wrong to ask them, but rather it's okay if they choose to do it. But I think as a first line, you always should offer the interpreter.
Okay, anyone else? I have to tell you, I have looked at this question over the years as being very much analogous to a Jehovah's Witness refusing a blood transfusion. It's something that you should never be expected to answer for in anyone else's presence, right? Because there is an inherently coercive or intimidating or burdensome influence if you're going to refuse a blood transfusion in the presence of someone who thinks that you should refuse a blood transfusion, even though you may not want to. And in an interpretation setting, to ask someone, is it okay if we use your daughter, adolescent, teenager, as an interpreter, is, I think, inherently coercive. And I think that conversation needs, at minimum, to go on with a hospital interpreter. And so the declining, I won't call it refusing because it's not an obligation, but the declining of interpretation services ought to go on through a hospital interpreter, whether live human or AV. Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I always find it helpful to analogize to other services that hospitals provide. And so if someone has whatever, needs to get their sheets changed, like we all change sheets in our own house. It's not that we don't know how to do it, but it is a totally inappropriate thing to say to someone's child or friend when they're at a hospital, oh, could you just quickly change this for us? And there's no person in their right mind that would say, I'll do that, because there's enough staff and they trust the hospital's expertise to do it. And so I think that, interpretation should be thought of in those same terms.
That's a great illustration, Andrew. Anyone else? Jorge.
Yeah, I would say one of my experiences at my fellowship was just dealing a lot of end-of-life issues as a clinical ethicist, of course. And I think it's very unfair for families to be put in a position where they have to interpret end-of-life conversations for their family, for the patient, who's like their mom, their dad, or whatever. And at some point, I remember even being in the room with interpreters, having the family member interpreting the medical team and whatnot, and they would say like, "Oh, say yes" in Spanish, "di que sí," and it's like you could see the coercion happening in front of you, and I know what it was because of course I know Spanish, but it's unfair because you're asking family members who have their grief, their guilt, their anticipatory, dying process as they're experiencing it from the outside, to be put in a situation where they have to listen to their loved one say like, "Oh, I want to die," or "No, I don't want to do this," or whatever. Like, it's one of the reasons why we have interpretation services as well. It's kind of taking that very hard conversation or hard, guilt or whatever, and placing in somebody who's more of one step away, right, from an emotional perspective, not so invested, so to speak. So, yeah.
Thank you, Jorge. Didi?
Yeah, I want to follow up with that. I was once an ad hoc interpreter, really bad one at that too. And I was asked at a clinic neurologist asked me to tell a patient, this is Dominican abuelito, I can see him as my grandfather, and he's like, tell him if he doesn't do this, he can die. And I was skirting. He's like, no, I did not say for you to say that. I said, tell him. I said, no, you cannot just tell him he's going to die. And I was skirting around, and he sensed it. He knew enough that he knew that I was not answering. But then I felt, the cultural, I call it cultural safety, right? It's like, wait, I can get to that. But, I need to say something first. I need to cushion the blow. And
Right.
I was not, I was a hospital staff, interpreting for a doctor who, this person isn't understanding me. come right away. And I just was pulled in. And I remember that, just not wanting to say you're going to die. Yeah, so Jorge, that brought me back.
Thanks to both of you for reinforcing my point that this is mostly an ethical discussion, right? The language skills are necessary, but certainly not sufficient in logic terms, which brings us to our next question, which is a really bold, gutsy question, one that I take a little personally. R asks, do you think it should be the medical education system's responsibility to require medical students and healthcare workers to be bilingual, or is that an unrealistic expectation? Anyone want to take that one? It's a tough question. Joyita?
Yeah, I can say, I think by the time the student is in medical school, the ship has sailed, because I, for example, also took French later on, and there's like that window of language acquisition, which is greatest like starting in early childhood and maybe closes, can't remember exactly when, but preteen. And once you're into adulthood, you're probably maybe never going to reach the level of fluency that's required to speak the language fluently enough to be able to not use an interpreter. So it'd be great if they encourage, all children to be bilingual, but I think to require that in medical school, certainly there are students who try to pick up usually it's Spanish as a second language, but it's really hard as you get older. You just are starting from a much it's an uphill challenge at that point.
So Tracy, if I recall, you're a native Quebec resident, a Quebecer or a Montrealian. So did you start out speaking principally French?
Yes, it's funny because I was actually going to say, in a place where French is mandatory. And so I actually grew up, I had to go to school in French. French is my mother tongue. And I spoke English at home with my dad, who's Anglophone. And so I consider myself, when people ask, are you Anglophone or Francophone? I'm bilingual. I always say I'm bilingual but I studied biology, science, everything in French until university. And so do many doctors. And so even if I look at the medical system in Montreal and Quebec, Montreal especially, because not everywhere else do they speak English, most will speak one language much better than the other, and that's their working language. And so again, it would be just enough, but I think it's impossible to be able to flip the switch and provide the services to the same standard in both languages.
Well, so let me ask you the follow-up question. It's the obvious question. How do you feel about your interpretation skills in Spanish compared to English, compared to French?
So as most interpreters or translators, we are much better translating from the target language into our primary language. And then, believe it or not, I have been speaking Spanish more than French since my 20s. And so I sometimes have to go back to my biology or thinking, what did my grandparents talk about? And so my adult life has been much more, I speak much more Spanish. I've studied much more Spanish. I lived much more with Spanish than with my French. So I'm much more comfortable interpreting or translating with Spanish.
Got it. So the next question is clearly for you, Tracy. A asks, do medical interpreters have access to special training on specific areas? For example, end-of-life care, hospice, and palliative care. Is that part of your profession today?
No. And that's one of the limitations. I actually was taking notes from something that Joyita said too. We also, part of the advocacy is also, I feel that we should be trained in social work. I think some of this, we get access to the CEUs, so the additional training. As I mentioned, it's 30 hours in within the 5 years. So that's not very much. I do a lot of work and studying on my own. So as I said, if I know something's coming up, or I had a cardiology interpretation recently that I was not expecting. And so I knew that if I was going back, because this child is going to be in the hospital for a long time, I should brush up on a lot of the different parts of the hearts and know my differences between the ventricles and the other cavity that I that I need to go back to. But anyway, I've had end of life, and that's one of my biggest complaints, is that I will tell the social worker as I'm going into the room that this is not about me, this is about the family. And so there are, you know, I might cry. There was a baby actively dying in the NICU, and they needed an interpreter for them to explain the next steps. And I said, I'm a mom, I've never done this. I haven't been trained in bereavement. And so I had, thankfully, the time to speak to a social worker, and she coached me and she stood next to me. And I was very, I hide behind my pad so that I'm a little bit, I kind of detach myself from the situation as best I can. And I think that I would seek that, and I speak to my supervisor about it. I'm fortunate to have a great team. And so I also need debriefing after the fact. It's very heavy to deal with a lot of these situations. And I'm like, I've been taught to say this, not to actually live this, or walking into, you know, post cardiology, post heart surgery. My very first interpretation alone, I had to step out because I fainted. Again, you know, I didn't go to medical school where they show me about blood or things that are really, so I've come up with my own practices, which I ask often the hospitalists if they're okay with it. Sometimes I turn my back, or I say I don't want to be that close, whatever it may be. But my primary goal is always to make sure that the patient and the provider have what they need for the relationship. If I can't do it, I will recuse myself.
Got it. So we're a little over time, but I want to hit one more question because it seems so important. And Andrew, it seems like a labor law question. What about protections and regulations for bilingual employees who do not wish to handle additional language-related duties in addition to their regular workload as it relates to workplace discrimination?
So, I've done labor law stuff, but it's much more non-payment of minimum wage and overtime than complicated things. My sense is this is the kind of stuff that is kind of par for the course negotiation between employees and employers, and, you know, unions and collective bargaining agreements play an important role. But it strikes me that it would be unusual for someone to assert that someone should have all of the responsibilities plus one, and be treated exactly the same as someone who has, you know, the other responsibilities. Normally in these negotiations, taking on of some additional responsibility then is, you know, balanced off by a commensurate reduction in other responsibilities.
And it does seem like disparate treatment and penalizing someone merely for the fact that they happen to be bilingual, and ignoring the fact made with one of the questions earlier that being bilingual is only necessary but not sufficient to be an interpreter, because of course you have to have the training on all of the ethics and the boundary issues and the emotional component of being the stranger in a medical conversation. So I think it's a problem that, frankly, I hadn't given a lot of thought to, and I'm going to think about some more. Any final thoughts from anyone before we wrap up? Well, this has been far, far in excess of all of my expectations. And I hope everyone who has participated tonight, including all of the people who asked all of those really remarkable questions, I hope you got out of this what you needed. And if you want more of this ethics content, feel free to contact us. That's my email address, dnh2101@columbia.edu. Feel free to go to our website. You just have to Google Columbia Bioethics events and it'll all come up. This program and all of our prior programs on implicit bias in healthcare and a whole range of other topics that cross the boundaries of law, medicine, and ethics are available. Can we put up the slide for what we have coming up soon as we say goodbye and as I say thank you to this really quite remarkable panel, Didi and Andrew, Jorge, Joyita, and Tracy. Thank you, really. This has been amazing. And again, an info session if you're thinking about studying bioethics further on the 15th, the ethics of telemental health, challenges, dilemmas, and opportunities, which is huge, on 11/27 online. That's a lunchtime program, and everything else that we do available on our webpage. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very
Bye.
grateful to all of you. This was marvelous. And Tracy, we have to talk. I want to package you up and roll you out to talk to clinicians of all stripes about the dimensions of interpretation that are beyond just the language part. I think that might actually be a whole webinar unto itself. So
Happily, thank you.
good night, all.